Hello everyone. In this lecture we're going to discuss policy and advocacy, where they overlap, where they don't, what they are, why we should care. We're starting to transition into kind of the rubber meets the road area of, well, this whole class. And as we start thinking about planning programs, health communication programs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and your projects in this class, this stuff's going to become really important for us as we move along. So let's get into it. In this lecture, we're going to cover the relationship between being a health communication professional and policy impact. We're going to discuss the difference between policy and advocacy, how they might compete, and how those things overlap. We're also going to talk about strategies for communicating with policymakers. And that's kind of from our perspective as citizens communicating to leadership more than the other way around. We're also going to talk about the nature of policy change and prioritizing health over activism, which I think is always an important thing to keep in mind. But let's go through these things one at a time. First of all, the relationship between being a health communication professional and someone who influences policy is a nuanced one at best. The textbook is arguing for us to recognize that any health communication professional needs to act as if their communication will impact policy. That's kind of your goal. And so we should take it seriously. What does that mean for us in terms of its implications? Well, let's consider the implications for all of the things we've already talked about: ethics, efficacy, evidence, and advocacy. We have an obligation to try and change things, but also to do it responsibly. Remember those challenges we've posed regarding ethical decisions, ethics versus efficacy. And I've often tried to emphasize that when it comes to communication, there isn't a very clear distinction between the two. We tend to believe that more ethical communication is also going to be more efficacious because the people who are being communicated to are going to be able to see that you have genuinely their best interest at heart, and they're going to be able to engage with the message and think about it rather than be suspicious about it or anything like that. But we've been over that before. Just keep it in mind here as we try and communicate to change policy. We also want to be doing so with good evidence in our pockets, in our hands, in our briefs. We want to make sure that we are pushing for something that does in fact have a scientific basis and is likely to improve things. That may sound like it's stating the obvious, but there are many times where people go about changing things and they don't really think about what they're trying to accomplish. Goals are very, very important, and so is evidence supporting those goals and reasons for those things. Likewise, advocacy, we're talking about defending or promoting the interests of a specific group when it comes to advocacy. And so that is important. Many groups need to have special representation, deserve special representation. Some might argue all individual groups have their unique considerations and therefore require unique advocates. However, we also want to be careful about promoting the well-being of one group over another, right? The well-being of one group shouldn't really come at the expense of another, and that's something that we recognize from diversity literature and a lot of things in that category. When we're talking about promoting the well-being of a specific group or advocating for them, ideally that should also benefit other groups. One of the examples that comes up in the diversity literature, for example, is for accessibility. So if we are improving, for instance, access to a building for wheelchairs, well, that's also going to make the building more accessible for people who don't need to use wheelchairs as well. There are automatic doors, there are ramps, etc. And so that's a common example of how advocating for one group shouldn't really cost anyone else anything else. And so we want to keep that in mind as well as we go forward and try to explore what advocacy looks like and when we're changing policies. So policy versus advocacy. When are they the same? When are they not? Well, let's think about the textbook definitions we've got here. Policy communication has to do with communicating technical data in support of a policy change, implementation, or evaluation of existing programs. Compare that to public advocacy, which is the strategic use of communication to affect changes in public opinion and attitude specifically to benefit a group, community, or organization. I'm paraphrasing a little bit what the textbook gave us to work with, but I want you to think about those two definitions and what they mean for you and what they mean for our action as communicators. So in this case, policy communication is specifically providing technical data in support of a policy change, implementation, or evaluation. So this is, all right, we have official postures in relation to a health issue, for example, and here's some technical information that some evidence, some scientific data that should support that position or say, maybe we should adjust this a little bit. Public advocacy is a deliberate strategic act of communication that is trying to change opinions and attitudes about something, usually to benefit a particular group. So that sounds perhaps a little manipulative, a little bit dangerous ethically. I agree with you if you think that. And that's why it's important to keep those kinds of safeguards in place and keep in mind what we're dealing with when it comes to advocacy. We should not be doing this blindly, and we shouldn't be doing it casually. We should take very seriously, again, going back to the top of the lecture here, the implications of our policy communication, of our health communication. We want to keep that in mind as we go forward. What are the possible implications of pursuing a specific course of action? Now, there's also a relationship that the textbook is trying to emphasize for us here with media advocacy. So when we're talking about public advocacy or advocacy of any kind, including things like lobbying efforts, anything trying to sway public opinion, there is, well, this is one of those domains that is really relying on media, new media in particular, and we'll look at some examples of that here. But think about how these messages are communicated. Most of the time when we're doing something like advocacy, we're trying to leverage multiple communication channels. That could be new media such as blogs, podcasts, social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. Or it could be older media such as radio shows, radio ads, television ads, newspaper, whatever it is. If we're trying to influence a lot of people, we're going to be leveraging a lot of different media channels. So let's think about some more of these implications. I'm not super comfortable putting them both in the same category because I think that policy should be a little bit more objective than advocacy, because advocacy is specifically pushing the benefit of a particular group. Now, in an ideal world, that shouldn't come at the cost of any other groups in particular. It should probably help everyone, but we're looking after the interests of one particular group. However, when that gets translated into lobbying efforts, when it gets translated into policy, some of that distinction, some of that nuance, and some of that good intention gets lost along the way, just as a consequence of being out in the real world and people having their own interests, etc. So setting policy means that we have to decide on best practices and procedures for large groups of people. And there are always going to be decisions to be made in terms of, well, ideally this shouldn't come at the cost of anyone, but we do have to decide where to allocate resources, where to allocate our attention or our energies. Now, advocacy means defending and promoting a specific policy posture. So again, it's going to be a little bit, there's going to be some overlap here, and sometimes it's possible for the interests of larger groups to come into competition with the interests of specific groups. So as we go forward and start thinking about programs, ask when these things overlap, when they complement each other, and when they might compete with each other. Ideally, we would like to have them complement each other. And we also need to ask ourselves how and when we need to maintain that distinction. So for example, if you are doing something like grant work, grant-funded research, if it is federally funded, you are actually prohibited from using those federal dollars for lobbying efforts. You cannot use that money to try and advocate for a specific group, but much of the research that we're doing is already community interest. It's specific. It is community specific. What's the difference there? Well, in the case of that kind of community engaged research, the grant money is then being used to generate knowledge in context and specifically in that community. And that's why we're so passionate about community engaged research, because we are empowering the community to act on their own behalf, not acting on their behalf. That's an important distinction to maintain. And I hope that you can keep that in mind as an example of how policy and advocacy can overlap and complement. So perhaps as an example of how these things are getting more intertwined over time, uh, the idea of pulling in new media and leveraging it for specific lobbying efforts. Well, we also are seeing politicians do this. So we were just previously discussing this from our perspective of health communication professionals trying to influence policy. But consider for a moment how new media functions in politicians communicating with their constituents. And so here's just some examples, some tweets from past and present presidents talking about health issues, specifically COVID, because isn't that all anyone ever talks about? These days, well, you can see some of these examples. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. These are coming from Twitter. So these are limited messages uh, coming from politicians signaling their position on some health issues, right? This is kind of one from older ones from 2020 and the older in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. You've got Donald Trump after he was recovering from COVID saying, don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. Feel better than I did 20 years ago. You also have Barack Obama, earlier that year saying, protect yourself and your community from coronavirus with common sense precautions. Wash your hands, stay home when sick, and listen to the CDC and local health authorities. Save the masks for healthcare workers. Stay calm, listen to the experts, and follow the science. Um, and then over here, we've got President Biden from about a year later saying America will never be fully safe while this pandemic is raging globally. That's why today I'm announcing that over the next 6 weeks, we will send 80 million vaccine doses overseas. It's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. It's the strong thing to do. Now, um, how do each one of these messages encapsulate a policy posture? How do they communicate what our leaders are thinking, feeling, and doing about an issue? How does it communicate to us how we as constituents should respond to these health issues? Each one of these is an example of health communication. They're an example of policy communication. Again, coming down from top down rather than bottom up, but you can see some of these similar principles here. And again, we're looking at this in the form of media, right? We can see in the case of some of these things here, right? You've got these are tweets, and like many new media, you get to see how many people these have engaged, how many likes, how many retweets, how many people are sharing this information. That creates a different picture as well. But it's always one nice thing about looking at those kinds of numbers is remembering that this is one person reaching out to many, many people, and how that can have predictable and unpredictable consequences. At any rate, policy communication could take many forms, and so can advocacy. Advocacy might look a little bit different than this, and that may be more coming from the bottom up. Now, of course, if there is overlap between the policymakers and the groups they represent, so if they move from straddling the line between leader into lobbyist, that's when we start encountering some of those ethical dilemmas and some problems in the public sphere. So it's another follow-up question you can kind of ask yourself is, do you think that a policymaker should also be an advocate? Should they be representing specific groups in their constituency, or do they need to do better at bridging all groups? You can probably guess which I would favor. I think that policymakers should be trying to represent the largest portion of their constituency possible rather than special interest groups. That's just kind of how it is, especially when we're talking about health. But that's neither here nor there. When we think about this coming from the other way, when we're thinking about advocacy and influencing policymakers, right? There's another way we could think of it. Advocacy is usually intended to influence policymakers, whereas the policy communication, that could be going either way. It could be policymakers talking about how we should have a posture about a health issue. But when we're talking about coming from the bottom up, this is what we're talking about. Ultimately, we are still talking about knowing our audience. In this case, it would be knowing our policymakers, knowing what their constituency wants, because they're paying attention to the constituency typically. So you could look at voting records. The textbook mentions that. You could see how people have voted on issues related to your health issue in the past. That's public record. You can go check that stuff out. Um, there's a lot of resources available to you, so don't be afraid to dig a little bit, do the research. But key strategies for communicating with policymakers about health issues, or any issue really. One, make meaningful connections. Think about your connection to the person you're approaching. If you are one of their constituents, which you should be if you're writing your senator, then you should communicate to them as one of their constituents. You should also describe the health issue in relation to your individual lived experience. Much like when you go to the doctor's office, it's going to work best if you talk about your health issue in relation to how it's impacting your life, your lived experience. That makes it more memorable, it makes it more impactful, and it gives some context as to what the issue you're discussing is. Be sure to define the problem and provide evidence. Just because you're using that personal narrative approach doesn't mean we don't need to have good, strong arguments. We always need to define our problem and provide good support for why it's a concern. You should also do your best to be concise. Limit the number of issues you tackle at a given time. Don't call up your senator and just list every grievance you have about government. That's not useful, helpful, or providing any clarity for them. Also be prepared to answer questions. If you are doing your job correctly and you're giving some new information to someone, well, they might have some questions about the thing that you're providing and what changes you're pursuing and what you expect to accomplish. Also, listen. Always a good recommendation, good skill to have. And be sure to be formal. That includes using polite, formal language, appropriate salutations, please, and thank you. So these are some general recommendations, and not only do they help you out in the real world, but they should help you with this class as well. This is probably a good time to ask how you're feeling about your upcoming analysis paper in this class. Do you hate that? Well, I'm trying to train you for something. So these skills are going to come in handy if you're out there in the real world. You graduate here, you discover yourself in a situation where someone's like, oh, you studied health communication, I could really use someone on my campaign trail. Hey, crazier things have happened. And everyone who's giving policy briefs on the campaign trail probably fell asleep a couple times in their health communication class. But keep this in mind, the analysis paper that you're working on and this kind of communication, that's very comparable to what we might be talking about with when the textbook mentions policy briefs, advocacy briefs, and objective briefs. What these look like are reports given to a policymaker or a leader or politician to accomplish specific goals. A policy brief is a concise summary of an issue of public interest. An advocacy brief specifically is arguing in favor for a specific course of action. An objective brief, and this one is not objective in the sense of like goals, this is objective in the sense that it is trying to give objective information for decision making. It's not trying to make the decision for the policymaker. It is trying to give them the best information possible for them to make a certain decision. If you're in an analyst role, if you're a CIA analyst, if you're a campaign analyst, if you're a health analyst, anything related to the government that is not being a public official, you're going to need to be aware of how these things work. These are supposed to be pretty brief. They're supposed to be like 3 pages. They're supposed to have good support. They're supposed to have well-reasoned argumentation. And so if you don't like the analysis paper, maybe this isn't for you. But this is the kind of position, like I have a friend I went to undergraduate with who just found himself writing speeches. He was an intern for the Obama campaign. And then like 5 years later, I met up with him in DC when I was there for a meeting, and he was writing speeches for the Attorney General, and he was doing stuff like this, right? He was doing the research for the Attorney General, writing things out, giving them briefs so that they could make policy decisions and affect official, postures on stage. So that's not like a humble brag or anything. I'm just saying, people who are in these positions. You might be a person in these positions. The kind of communication that we are practicing in the form of writing something like an analysis paper is designed to mimic these kinds of real world products. So keep that in mind. I know it's tedious, but the more you get those skills under your belt, the better off you'll be. Let's start to wrap up this discussion with a brief discussion of the nature of policy change. We want to keep in mind that it is slow. But sustainable efforts can affect huge change down the road. It requires sustainable efforts, and it requires you to recognize that things are slow. Um, it moves perhaps a little faster than academic time. I have a paper that got back on my desk. I'm trying to get published. It came back from my collaborators, and sometimes it sits on people's desks for months. The government is not much quicker. You try and file for a permit of some kind, you're waiting 6 to 8 weeks. So we need patience. We need to plan in advance, and we can't just be reactive. Some final notes here on prioritizing health over activism. You may have noticed that I am interested in promoting health. And I think that that's more important than having our way in terms of winning a political discussion or election or anything else. Um, I encourage you as you go forward to question your own motives and other people's motives. I don't mean that in terms of being cynical. I want you to be realistic. So, why are you trying to accomplish a goal? If the answer to that question um, ever shifts from trying to promote health and health literacy to something else, well, I'm not saying to stop what you're doing, but I do think that we all have an obligation to consider that and try to make sure that even while we're reaching our own goals, that we are considering the bigger implication. But ask yourself that question about your own behavior and other people's behavior. Again, we don't have to be totally suspicious and cynical, but ask yourself where the incentives are for change or not change. It's usually pretty obvious. And when we're talking about something like policy, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of information you can access. Also ask yourself where the evidence is. Um, Likewise, if you are promoting a specific health message, if you're promoting a certain behavior for political reasons rather than evidence-based health reasons, I think that's a big problem. You want to be as accurate as you can be in your decision making, but this kind of goes back to our original discussions of ethics. You got to be careful how much responsibility you take for other people's actions. Do you really want to have absolute control over someone's health? Because then you're responsible for it, right? So when in doubt, try to empower people rather than dictate what they should, can, must do. Um, you'll sleep better at night, if nothing else. But that's also the best way to affect change in meaningful ways. If the health behavior is beneficial and you illustrate that, then you need to trust that people will make that decision in their own best interest. But I've talked enough for one day. I hope that this has given you just a little bit of context to go forward and work on these projects, these interventions, and these programs, and reinforce the importance of some of these topics. I'll see you next time when we are discussing the actual planning process, and we're going to get really focused on putting that rubber to the road and start putting this stuff into practice. That's all for today. Thank you.